Replacing one offensive lineman is normal, replacing two Rays is concern, but replacing all five starters at once. That almost never happens in the NFL. And yet, that's exactly what just happened in Cleveland. The Browns didn't tweak the line, they didn't shuffle pieces, they wiped the entire front clean, five starters gone just like that. When something that drastic happens, it's not random. Teams don't scrap an entire protection unit unless something deeper was broken. And that's where the conversation gets uncomfortable. Because this move didn't just come after a bad stretch. It came after weeks of debate surrounding Shedeur Sanders, his performance, his protection, and whether the struggles were really his fault. Now fans are asking a bold question. Was this simply roster accountability or proof that something behind the scenes wasn't right? Either way, one thing is clear. Cleveland didn't just adjust. They detonated the problem. You almost never see this in the NFL. One lineman gets replaced, normal two starters gone, concerning three, now you're talking about a rebuild. But all five. That's not a rebuild, that's a demolition. The Cleveland Browns didn't just make adjustments, they cleared the entire front. Every single starting offensive lineman from the previous unit, gone. That kind of reset sends a message louder than any press conference ever could. Because offensive line continuity is sacred in the NFL. These five guys operate like a synchronized unit. Timing, communication, trust. You don't casually scrap that unless something underneath was fractured beyond repair. Teams invest years building chemistry up front. They tolerate struggles, they tweak technique, they adjust schemes. They do not wipe the board clean unless there's a deeper issue. And that's why this move feels different. At first glance, some fans chalked it up to performance. Maybe the unit underachieved, maybe protection metrics were bad, maybe it was simply time for a youth movement. But when you step back, the scale of the change raises eyebrows. Five starters. That's not coincidence, that's diagnosis. It suggests internal film sessions weren't pretty. It suggests effort questions were raised. It suggests communication breakdowns weren't isolated incidents but recurring patterns. And when an organization acts this decisively, it usually means the evaluation process uncovered something they couldn't ignore. Now here, where things get interesting. The purge happened during a stretch where Shedeur Sanders was taking heavy criticism. Sacks were piling up, drives were stalling, analysts debated whether he was holding the ball too long or failing to process quickly enough. But once the entire offensive line was dismissed, the conversation shifted. Because when five blockers disappear at once, it forces everyone to reconsider what they were watching. Protection isn't just about sacks, it's about pocket stability. It's about whether a quarterback can step into throws without immediate chaos. It's about whether pressure is occasional or constant. And constant pressure changes everything. Even great quarterbacks struggle when protection collapses instantly. Timing routes break down, reads speed up unnaturally, mechanics tighten, stats suffer. So when Cleveland chose to reset the entire unit, it felt like more than performance frustration. It felt like accountability. It felt like the organization quietly admitting that the structure around their quarterback wasn't good enough. And that kind of move doesn't happen unless leadership believes the quarterback is worth protecting. That's the key detail. Teams don't detonate a full offensive line unless they're committed to what's behind it. If there were doubts about Shedeur being the long-term answer, the easier path would have been gradual change. A piece here, a tweak there. Instead, they chose the nuclear option, which signals belief. It signals urgency. And it signals that whatever was happening up front, whether it was technical failure, chemistry collapse, or something else entirely, was unacceptable moving forward. The NFL rarely sees a full five-man reset. And when it does, it's never random. It's a statement. And Cleveland just made one loud enough for the entire league to hear. This is where the story took a sharp turn. At first, it was just frustration. Fans upset about protection, analysts debating mechanics, normal football talk, but once the Browns wiped out the entire offensive line, the tone online shifted from criticism to suspicion. Rumors started circulating. Not confirmed reports, not official statements, just patterns people thought they were seeing. Some fans began saying Shedeur Sanders wasn't struggling because he wasn't ready, he was surviving something broken around him. Others went further, suggesting the dysfunction felt too consistent to be accidental. To be clear, there is no verified evidence of intentional sabotage, no public accusation, no internal document leaked confirming anything deliberate, but perception spreads fast, especially when film clips start circulating. And the film gave people questions. Repeated free rushers off the edge, guards stepping the wrong way at critical moments, communication breakdowns that seem to happen on third and long more often than random probability would suggest. When isolated, those are just bad plays. When repeated weekly, fans start connecting dots. Online breakdown accounts began freezing frames, slowing down snaps, pointing at half-steps that looked mistimed. The phrase pattern recognition started trending in comment sections. Was it poor coaching, bad chemistry, or something more strategic? Again, important to say, those questions remain speculative, but timing fueled the fire. Because before the offensive line purge, criticism centered on Shedeur. He holds the ball too long, he drifts in the pocket, he's not processing fast enough. Then the linemen were dismissed. And suddenly, people revisited the same plays with a different lens. The sacks that looked like indecision started looking like survival. The stalled drives started looking like structural collapse. And once 5 starters were gone, the idea that the quarterback was the sole issue became harder to defend. That's when the word sabotage entered the conversation. Not from team officials, from fans, from podcasts, from social media analysts who believed the protection failures were too synchronized to be coincidence. Some reports claimed internal reviews showed effort inconsistencies. Others suggested that trust between certain players and leadership had fractured late in the season. Again, none of this has been officially confirmed, but in today's NFL media cycle, even whispers carry weight. And here's the reality: when a team acts that drastically, it creates space for conspiracy theories. Because organizations don't fire 5 starters for small reasons, so when fans can't immediately see the internal explanation, they create their own. The most aggressive theory, that limiting Shedeur's statistical success would justify pivoting elsewhere. That theory remains unproven. There's no direct evidence tying protection breakdowns to intentional design. But perception doesn't wait for proof, it moves at the speed of clips. And once the term sabotage sticks, even loosely, it reshapes how every play is interpreted. The Browns haven't publicly addressed those rumors in detail. They've let the roster moves speak for themselves. But the damage, or the awakening, depending on perspective, is already done. Because now, instead of asking whether Shedeur was struggling, fans are asking something far bigger. Was he fighting more than just opposing defenses? And that question alone changes the entire narrative moving forward. Forget the headlines for a second. Forget the rumors, forget the talk shows, go back to the film. Because the tape doesn't care about narratives. When you slow it down and watch snap by snap, something becomes obvious almost immediately. The pocket wasn't just collapsing occasionally, it was collapsing fast, sometimes instantly. Edge rushers weren't fighting through blocks, they were appearing untouched. Guards weren't losing long battles, they were taking one false step and the play was already compromised. On multiple third and long situations, pressure arrived before routes even had time to develop. That changes everything. From a casual viewer's perspective, a sack looks like indecision. But on film, you can see timing, you can count seconds. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, sometimes Shedeur barely reached 2 before chaos hit. That's not a clean evaluation environment for any quarterback. And yet, here's the part that's hard to ignore. Even under that kind of stress, he delivered flashes that don't look like a quarterback drowning. You see him step up through collapsing lanes instead of drifting backward. You see subtle slides left or right to buy fractions of a second. You see eyes downfield while defenders are closing in, and occasionally you see throws that make you pause the screen. Tight windows, back shoulder placements, red zone darts between linebackers. Those aren't panic throws. Those are composed decisions made under pressure. Surface stats don't capture that. A box score won't show how quickly protection failed. It won't show how often pressure altered route timing. It won't show how many completions came while absorbing hits. Film does. There's also the pressure rate factor. When a quarterback consistently faces early disruption, mechanics tighten, footwork speeds up unnaturally, progressions shorten. That impacts completion percentage and drives sustainability. Yet in multiple sequences, Shedeur adjusted. Instead of bailing from clean lanes, he climbed when he could. Instead of forcing deep shots recklessly, he checked down when necessary. Instead of looking rattled, he reset and fired. That doesn't mean every play was perfect. No quarterback is flawless. There were moments of hesitation. A few plays where holding the ball longer didn't help. That's normal development. But the broader pattern shows resilience. The most telling moments are third downs. That's where pressure packages intensify. That's where communication matters most. And in several of those situations, protection broke down early, yet the ball still left his hand accurately. That's not a quarterback being carried. That's a quarterback compensating. Now here's the critical distinction. Film shows dysfunction up front. It does not prove intent. It shows breakdowns. It shows repeated pressure. It shows inconsistencies in timing and leverage. Whether that was chemistry issues, scheme flaws, or something else entirely remains unconfirmed. But the visual evidence shifts the narrative. Instead of asking, "Is he ready?" the better question becomes, "How would this look with stability?" Because if the tape shows anything clearly, it's this. He wasn't operating in comfort. He was operating in survival mode. And despite that, he still flashed high-level traits. That's not hype. That's what the film actually shows. This is where the situation gets layered. Because roster changes are one thing, but when tension starts to feel philosophical about control, reps, and direction, that's when speculation grows. Publicly, there were already signs of friction. Practice reps reportedly fluctuated. The quarterback competition narrative stayed alive longer than expected. At times, the spotlight subtly leaned toward alternatives, including Dylan Gabriel. That part wasn't hidden. Coaches often keep competition open. That's standard NFL procedure. But the optics created questions. When a young quarterback flashes high-level plays yet continues to see limited rhythm-building reps, fans notice. When performance under pressure doesn't translate to consistent structural support, fans connect dots. And when protection issues pile up without immediate correction, people start wondering about internal priorities. To be clear, there is no confirmed evidence of intentional undermining from the coaching staff. None. What exists is perception, and perception can be powerful. Some observers felt the situation reflected an old-school coaching instinct: control the environment first, validate the plan later. In that view, if a quarterback's numbers dip, it becomes easier to justify pivoting direction. Again, that's speculative, but it's a theory that gained traction once the offensive line reset happened. Because here's the subtle tension. Coaches are hired to install systems, quarterbacks often reshape them. If a quarterback plays outside structure, improvising, extending plays, creating off-script, some coaches celebrate that. Others prefer precision within design. When those philosophies clash, friction can develop quietly. Shedeur's style under pressure leaned toward adaptation, sliding in collapsing pockets, resetting platforms mid-play, extending drives with creativity. That can look heroic or undisciplined depending on perspective. And that's where control enters the equation. Was limiting reps simply strategic caution? Was pushing competition meant to sharpen development? Or was there uncertainty about building the offense fully around him? Those questions remain unanswered publicly. But when you combine fluctuating opportunities, protection instability, and later a full-line purge, it's natural for fans to revisit earlier coaching decisions. There's also timing to consider. If an organization truly believed in long-term development around its quarterback, protection reinforcement would typically be priority one. When that didn't immediately materialize and instead criticism focused heavily on execution, it created imbalance in perception. Again, none of this proves intent. It highlights alignment. Alignment between coaching philosophy and quarterback trajectory is everything in the NFL. When those two forces sync, growth accelerates. When they hesitate, tension builds. And once leadership changed direction, wiping out the offensive line and signaling structural accountability, it felt like a philosophical pivot as much as a personnel one. Almost like the franchise chose clarity. That doesn't necessarily mean previous coaching decisions were malicious. It could mean they were cautious, conservative, unsure. But in a league that moves fast, uncertainty can look like resistance. Now with the reset complete, the dynamic shifts. Because once an organization clears the path, it signals something quietly but clearly. The quarterback is no longer adapting to the system. The system is adapting to him. And that kind of shift doesn't just change depth charts. It changes power. This might be the most fascinating part of the entire saga. Because before the offensive line purge, the tone around Shedeur was sharp, direct, sometimes dismissive. Headlines focused on sacks. Segments questioned decision-making. Analysts dissected whether he was holding the ball too long or drifting into pressure. The discussion felt centered on one theme: is he ready? And that framing matters. When a quarterback struggles statistically, it's easy to zoom in on mechanics. Arm angle, footwork, processing speed. It's cleaner, simpler, it fits the format of a debate show. But once all 5 offensive linemen were replaced, the conversation shifted. Suddenly, analysts started mentioning protection breakdowns. Pressure rates were brought up. Film clips highlighting free rushers began circulating more widely. The same plays that once framed Shedeur as overwhelmed started being reframed as resilient. That's not an accident. Media narratives evolve with new information. When a roster move that drastic happens, it forces recalibration. You can't argue that protection was fine when the organization just wiped out the entire unit. And here's the subtle part. The early coverage focused heavily on quarterback flaws. The later coverage acknowledged structural issues. That shift didn't come from speculation, it came from action. The Browns' decision spoke loudly. Once 5 starters were gone, it became harder to pin everything on the quarterback. The narrative had to widen, it had to account for systemic breakdown. And fans noticed the pivot. Clips from earlier broadcasts resurfaced. Comment sections compared takes from before and after. The same analysts who questioned readiness now spoke about adversity. The language softened. From "is he the problem" to "look what he endured." That evolution doesn't mean media voices were acting maliciously. It reflects how football discourse works. Analysts respond to available evidence, and new evidence changes emphasis. But it also highlights how quickly perception can solidify. When early struggles are framed through a quarterback-centric lens, it sticks. Casual viewers don't always revisit film once opinions form. First impressions linger longer than corrections. That's why the offensive line reset was so powerful. It disrupted the initial storyline. Instead of asking whether Shedeur was holding the ball too long, people started asking how often he even had a clean pocket. Instead of questioning composure, viewers replayed clips of him standing tall under pressure. The lens flipped. And once that happens, everything feels different. Even small completions look more impressive. Even minor mistakes look contextualized rather than fatal. This is how narratives in sports evolve, not through apologies but through reframing. The media didn't announce a correction. The roster move did it for them. And now, instead of debating whether Shedeur can handle the league, the conversation is trending towards something more dangerous. What happens if he finally gets stability? Because once the spotlight shifts from flaws to resilience, the entire tone changes. And in today's NFL media cycle, tone can shape legacy faster than stats ever could. When a team replaces one offensive lineman, it's about improvement. When it replaces 2, it's about adjustment. When it replaces all 5, that's a declaration. Cleveland didn't quietly rotate pieces, they didn't patch the leaks. They tore the whole wall down and started over. And in the NFL, moves that drastic are never just about performance metrics. They're about accountability, about trust, about direction. Because here's the truth: offensive line play is collective. One weak link can hurt you, but 5 starters being replaced means leadership believed the issue wasn't isolated. it was systemic. That's not tinkering. That's a reset of philosophy. It sends a message to the locker room first. Protect the quarterback or you're not part of the future. No more excuses, no more we'll fix it in practice. No more subtle breakdowns being brushed off as communication errors. When contracts end and lockers get cleared at that scale, the tone inside the building changes instantly. But it also sends a message externally. It tells fans the organization saw what they saw. It acknowledges that the chaos wasn't sustainable. And whether the struggles were purely technical or something deeper, the front office decided it was unacceptable. That matters for one big reason. Teams don't wipe out an entire offensive line unless they've made a decision about who they're protecting. You don't detonate the shield unless you believe in the quarterback behind it. If Cleveland had uncertainty about Shedeur Sanders long-term, the safer move would have been incremental change. Replace a guard, draft a tackle, slow transition. Instead, they chose urgency. That urgency feels intentional. It signals that the franchise is done debating whether protection issues were situational. They've chosen clarity, and clarity is powerful in the NFL. Because once leadership makes a move like this, there's no gray area left. The rebuild isn't theoretical anymore, it's visible, it's structural. There's also risk in this kind of reset. Continuity along the offensive line takes time. Chemistry can't be forced overnight. So making this move means the organization is betting that short-term adjustment pain is worth long-term stability. And that kind of bet usually centers on one thing: the quarterback's trajectory. This reset says, we are not letting structural instability define our offense anymore. It says, if there were breakdowns, they stop now. It says, the next version of this team starts with protection. Whether fans believe previous issues were just underperformance or something more complicated, the response was decisive. And decisiveness in the NFL often reflects conviction. Conviction about identity. Conviction about direction. Conviction about who the franchise centerpiece is. Replacing 5 linemen isn't just a roster update. It's a signal flare. It tells the league Cleveland is choosing alignment over confusion, stability over speculation, commitment over hesitation. And when an organization makes that loud of a statement, the next chapter isn't about doubt. It's about execution. Because now there are no half measures left. The line is rebuilt. The message is clear. Protect the quarterback or you're not part of what comes next. Now here, where this entire story shifts from reaction to strategy. Because Cleveland isn't walking into 2026 empty-handed, they're walking in loaded. Multiple early-round picks, depth across the board, flexibility to move up, move down, or stack premium positions. On paper, that kind of draft capital screams rebuild. But this doesn't feel like a rebuild anymore. It feels targeted. When a team replaces all 5 offensive linemen and then enters a draft with serious capital, that's not random alignment. That's blueprint planning. And the blueprint seems centered around one question. How do we maximize Shedeur Sanders right now? For years, Cleveland has operated in uncertainty at quarterback. Draft picks were hedged, investments were cautious, protection was pieced together, weapons were rotated in and out. That era looks finished. You don't clean house on the offensive line unless you're committing to the quarterback behind it. And once that commitment is made, the draft board changes. It's no longer best player available. It becomes best player for the quarterback. That's a massive shift in philosophy. Now imagine the draft room. 2 first-round picks, strong second-round positioning, 10 total selections to shape the roster. That's power. And power used correctly builds contenders fast. The obvious priority: reinforcement. Anchor tackles, guards who specialize in pass protection, linemen with discipline and communication IQ. If Cleveland double dips up front, no one should be surprised. But protection alone isn't the full blueprint. Quarterbacks thrive on chemistry, so the receiver room matters too. Vertical threats, route technicians, reliable red zone targets, players who snap routes at precise depths and adjust mid-play without hesitation. Because here's the reality: Once you decide the quarterback is the engine, everything else becomes fuel. There's also defensive temptation in drafts like this. Linebackers, edge rushers, secondary depth. Analysts will debate positional value endlessly, but Cleveland's front office knows something the mock drafts don't. The fastest way to stabilize a franchise is to make your quarterback comfortable. History backs that up. Teams that commit early to protecting and empowering their signal caller accelerate growth. Teams that split focus too widely often stall. So this draft feels less like experimentation and more like alignment. And here's the hidden pressure. If Cleveland uses premium picks on positions that don't directly support Shedeur's development, questions will rise immediately. Fans won't tolerate half measures anymore. After the offensive line purge, expectations changed. The message was clear: we're building around him. Now the draft has to echo that message. Every selection becomes symbolic. A first-round lineman says, "We're serious about protection." A dynamic receiver says, "We're serious about explosion." A steady tight end says, "We're serious about reliability." The 2026 draft isn't just about filling holes. It's about confirming identity. Because once you reset the structure and clear the dysfunction, there's no excuse left. The blueprint has to be clean, focused, intentional. Cleveland has the capital. Now they have to prove they have the clarity. And if they execute this correctly, this won't look like a rebuild at all. It'll look like the beginning of something far more dangerous, a franchise finally moving in one direction with no hesitation. Protection was the loudest issue, but chemistry. That might be the quiet one that decides everything. Because even with a rebuilt offensive line, an offense doesn't fully stabilize unless the quarterback and receivers move like one unit. Timing, trust, route depth, adjustments mid-play, that's the engine behind every explosive offense in the league. And Cleveland's receiver room is now under a different microscope. When the chaos up front dominated headlines, receiver inconsistencies were easier to overlook. A route drift here, a mistimed break there, a ball slightly off target that might have looked like quarterback error at first glance. But once the protection narrative shifted, fans started rewinding more closely. Timing matters. When a quarterback releases the ball before a receiver makes his cut, that's trust. When a receiver adjusts instantly on a scramble drill, that's chemistry. When those things don't happen, drives stall even if the protection holds. There were flashes of alignment. The connection with Isaiah Bond has looked promising in stretches. Sharp route running, explosive separation, body language that suggests confidence in the read, that kind of emerging rhythm is what you build around. But not every rep felt synchronized. There were moments where spacing looked off, plays where receivers appeared to interpret coverage differently than the quarterback. That doesn't mean sabotage. It doesn't even necessarily mean dysfunction. It can simply mean transition, a room adjusting to a new offensive identity. Still, in a reset year, every detail stands out. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When a franchise decides who its quarterback is, everyone else must align fully with that direction. There's no room for half commitment, no space for lingering stylistic mismatches. The chemistry either grows quickly or decisions follow. Receiver-quarterback relationships are fragile early on. They're built on repetition, film study, shared understanding of leverage and timing. If that rhythm builds, it can elevate an entire offense. If it doesn't, even talent won't mask it. Cleveland now faces a subtle but critical choice. Do they double down on receivers who clearly mesh with Shedeur's tempo, or do they prioritize pure talent and hope the chemistry develops later? History shows that chemistry often outweighs raw ability in tight situations. 3rd and 5 in the fourth quarter isn't about athletic testing numbers, it's about trust. Knowing your receiver will snap the route exactly at the marker, knowing he'll flatten against zone or sit in soft coverage without hesitation. That's precision. And precision builds over time, or it fractures under pressure. The offensive line reset sent a loud message about protection. The receiver room now carries a quieter challenge: synchronization. Because even with stability up front, timing issues can sabotage momentum just as quickly. This next phase isn't about drama, it's about refinement. Which players adjust seamlessly to Shedeur's cadence, which receivers instinctively extend plays when he leaves the pocket, which ones anticipate instead of react. Those details will determine whether this reset becomes a leap forward or just another transition. Protection gives a quarterback time. Chemistry turns that time into touchdowns. And now that the line has been rebuilt, the spotlight moves outward toward the players catching the passes. Because in this new era, alignment isn't optional. It's everything. So what was it really? Was this a sabotage story or a survival story? Because depending on how you interpret the sequence of events, this saga looks completely different. If you believe the rumors, the whispers, the online breakdowns, then this feels darker. It feels like a young quarterback navigating dysfunction that went beyond normal growing pains. 5 linemen replaced, coaching tension, protection collapsing at the worst moments. From that angle, it looks like Shedeur Sanders was swimming upstream the entire time. But here's the part that matters. There is no confirmed proof of intentional sabotage, no official report, no public statement declaring anyone undermined him. What we have are patterns, timing, and reaction. And sometimes in the NFL, patterns are enough to spark debate but not enough to prove intent. So maybe this isn't a sabotage story. Maybe it's a survival story. Because when you strip away speculation and focus purely on what we saw, one thing stands out: he didn't fold. The pocket collapsed and he adjusted, criticism mounted and he stayed composed. The offensive line was wiped out and he remained the centerpiece. That's not weakness. That's durability. And durability at quarterback is rare. The real turning point wasn't the rumors, it wasn't the podcasts, it wasn't even the media pivot. It was the organization's response. Replacing all 5 starters is an admission that something wasn't good enough. It's a reset that says, we're not letting this continue. And when a franchise makes a move that drastic, it tells you who they've chosen to build around. You don't detonate the structure unless you believe in what's inside it. That's why this moment feels bigger than roster shuffling. It feels like alignment. The Browns could have slowly phased out pieces. They could have drafted replacements quietly. They didn't. They went bold, and bold moves usually follow conviction. Now the noise is quieter. The line is rebuilt, the coaching dynamic has shifted, the draft capital is loaded. The excuses for everyone are gone. And that's what makes this next chapter dangerous. Because if Shedeur was producing flashes in chaos, what happens with stability? If he was threading passes under siege, what happens when the pocket actually forms? If resilience defined the first phase, what defines the second? This is no longer about surviving dysfunction. It's about capitalizing on clarity. The sabotage theory may never be fully confirmed or denied. It may live forever in fan debates and internet threads, but what can be confirmed is this. He endured. He adjusted. He stayed standing while the structure around him changed. That's not a narrative. That's observable. So maybe the better question isn't whether he was sabotaged. Maybe it's this. Was that stretch the moment a franchise quarterback proved he could handle chaos? Because if that's the case, then this wasn't a breakdown. It was a test. And now that the storm has cleared, the league is about to find out what he looks like when he's finally operating in calm. That's not speculation. That's the part that should make everyone nervous.